Hi everyone, my name is Safa, and I'll be talking to you all about my research, which is looking into quiet challenges we carry as trainee counselors when practicing, but more specifically, social anxiety as the challenge. Before I begin talking about my research or what I found, I want to share how this project actually came about. It actually began during my very first practice triad session in year one. I remember being asked to practice a session as a counselor, surrounded by people I had just met, and in that moment, expecting myself to hold space, to be present, and to somehow carry a session while also being observed by my tutors. It felt like I had been put on the spot, and something in me would always just tense up. I struggled to find my words to settle into the room. And I remember wondering, is everyone else finding this easier than I am? Later, I realized it wasn't just shyness, it was social anxiety. Some days I left practice sessions feeling like I was fooling everyone. Even myself, I performed a version of me that had it together. But underneath, I felt anxious, unsure, and at times like an imposter. And as I began to open up with my peers and my friends on the course, I found out I wasn't alone. Many of us were carrying similar struggles, just quietly. That realization sparked this research idea, and I wanted to explore if internal emotional struggles like social anxiety are quietly shaping how we practice as counselors and in what ways exactly do they really affect us? Because the truth is, we don't walk into the counseling room as a blank slate. We bring ourselves, and if we carry unresolved internal struggles like social anxiety, and especially if we're not aware of them, they might be shaping our practice in ways we don't always notice. So let's look a little deeper into this. Naturally, this took me to also look into one of the most commonly researched concepts for trainee counselors, which is burnout. Burnout is defined as a state of emotional, mental, and physical exhaustion caused by prolonged stress. It's especially common in careers that require sustained empathy and emotional depth, which is at the heart of our work as counselors. It shows up as emotional exhaustion, a sense of depersonalization or detachment from clients, and a loss of personal efficacy. That feeling of I'm not making a difference or I'm not good enough. Research has found that trainee counselors are particularly vulnerable because of the dual pressure, both from academic demands and emotionally driven placement work. And it's not as rare as we may think, as it was found that 67% of mental health professionals have experienced burnout. That's two thirds of us. This means that this is something that a lot of us might be familiar with. So clearly, burnout is a real issue, but I started wondering what makes some trainees feel less vulnerable to it than others. And that led me to the jobs demands resource model. It helped me make sense of this. It proposes that burnout doesn't just come from working hard, it comes from an imbalance. Specifically, when the demands of your job outweigh the resources you have to meet them. In our training, those demands might be something like the emotional labor of client work, constant academic deadlines, or even the pressure of being observed in a triad. On the other side, the resources we are meant to rely on include supervision, peer support, and access to therapy. But here's the catch. As some research argue that resources will only work if they're actually accessible to everyone. And that's where things get interesting because indeed, another study found that support from colleagues did reduce burnout, but it didn't reduce anxiety. So, in other words, support helps, but it might not be enough for everyone. This got me thinking maybe the issue isn't whether support exists, maybe it's about whether we can emotionally reach for it as well. The JDR model is helpful, but it assumes that all resources like peer support or supervision are emotionally accessible to everyone. But for trainees struggling with social anxiety, those very resources can feel emotionally unsafe. Social anxiety doesn't just make us nervous, it can distort how we perceive connection. It might make us hold back in group supervision or hesitate to ask for help, even when it's available. While there wasn't any research particularly for social anxiety, studies on anxiety found that it reduces counseling competency and makes it harder for trainees to seek help. Similarly, another study showed that higher levels of anxiety in trainees are linked to lower self efficacy in counseling. In other words, trainees are more likely to doubt their ability to be effective counselors. So, even if the support is technically there, trainees who are socially anxious might struggle to access it, not because they don't want to, but because it doesn't feel emotionally safe enough or tailored for them to reach for. So, this brings us to the next key concept, which is social connectedness. When we think of social support, we often imagine just having people around, like friends, classmates, or even our tutors. But social connectedness goes a level deeper, kind of the extra mile of not just finding out about who's there for us, but also how emotionally close we feel, how emotionally close and safe we actually feel around them. Lee and Robbins define it as our subjective sense of belonging and emotional closeness, not just proximity, but that inner feeling of being seen and supported. Why does this matter? Because feeling connected protects us in emotionally demanding roles. In fact, a study found that this sense of connection can buffer stress, especially in professions like ours where emotional stress is part of the job. More studies also found social connectedness to be linked with reduced depression and increased well being. And in the context of counseling, it has been highlighted that feeling emotionally connected supports trainees' resilience. So even if we have access to support like supervisors, tutors, or peers, without that inner sense of connection, we may not truly feel truly held by it. For those of us experiencing social anxiety, even the most well meaning environments can feel emotionally out of reach. And when we feel disconnected on the inside, it becomes harder to fully receive the support that's technically there. Not because we don't want it, but because it doesn't feel emotionally safe enough to access. And this is where social support theory comes in. Social support theory explains that social support plays a protective role against stress. It helps us regulate emotion, feel connected, and stay resilient, especially in emotionally demanding environment like ours, like our therapy sessions. But here's the thing, this theory tends to assume that support is not only available, but that we feel emotionally safe enough to reach for it. And that's where social anxiety complicates things. Support is only protective if it's perceived as emotionally safe and responsive, which isn't always the case for those of us struggling with social anxiety. It can trigger fears of judgment or a sense that we're being a burden, even when people are willing to help. So the question still remains, if we don't feel safe enough to reach out, can we really benefit from the support around us? In fact, this made me wonder, if burnout is rising in this profession, and if social connectedness is meant to protect us, then how might social anxiety be quietly interfering with this whole equation? And if it even has any impact on any of this? This led me to my research question, which is, does social anxiety help explain why occupational burnout might reduce our sense of social connectedness? In other words, if we're burnt out, does it raise our social anxiety, which then makes us feel even more disconnected from others? That became the heart of my study. So, based on that, I hypothesized two things, that higher levels of occupational burnout would be linked to lower levels of social connectedness, and that this link would be explained or mediated by social anxiety. If this is true, it could help us better understand how internal emotional challenges like anxiety shape not just how we feel, but how we connect, and ultimately, how we practice as counselors. So, how did I go about exploring this? I used a quantitative cross sectional online survey design. I collected data using self report questionnaires. My participants were 64 trainee counselors, all studying in the UK on level 4 or above counseling programs. They were either on placement or doing practice triad group work. Recruitment happened mainly through Instagram, WhatsApp, my group supervisions network, and course directors at different universities that we have reached out to. I used three validated psychological measures. Burnout was assessed with the Burnout Assessment Tool. Social anxiety was measured using the Social Phobia Inventory, and social connectedness was measured using the Social Connectedness Scale revised. To analyze the data, I used Hayes's process macro specifically Model 4, which tests for mediation. Now let's take a look at what I found. First, occupational burnout significantly predicted higher levels of social anxiety, so the more burnt out participants felt, the more socially anxious they were likely to be. Then, social anxiety significantly and negatively predicted social connectedness, meaning the more socially anxious someone was, the less emotionally connected they felt to others. But here's the twist, burnout did not significantly predict social connectedness directly. However, there was a significant indirect effect, meaning social anxiety fully mediated the relationship between burnout and social connectedness. In other words, burnout affects how connected someone feels, but only through its impact on social anxiety. So, what does all of this really tell us? At first glance, it might seem obvious. Social anxiety makes connection harder, but what my study actually uncovered was something a little bit deeper. Burnout alone didn't directly reduce connection. That link only became significant through social anxiety. In other words, Emotional exhaustion didn't just lead people to feel disconnected, it likely made them more socially anxious, which then made connection feel emotionally unsafe or out of reach. Okay, I know it's starting to sound a bit complicated, but actually, what it's telling us is that it's not just the external demands of our training or the essays, the placements, the client work that affect how we show up, it's also our internal landscape. The anxiety we carry often quietly can ripple into how we relate to our peers, our supervisors, and even our clients, and it's not always visible on the surface. This also helps us revisit the jobs demand resources model. We often focus on the availability of support, supervision, peers, therapy, but maybe we need to look deeper into emotional accessibility. Support only works if we can emotionally reach for it. Likewise, social support theory assumes support buffers stress, but again, that hints at feeling safe enough to receive it. And for socially anxious trainees, even warm, well meaning support can feel risky or exposing. So the bigger question becomes how can we as a profession create safer emotional spaces for ourselves, not just physically supportive environments, but ones where it actually feels okay to be vulnerable. Actually, better yet, what does all of this mean for us as trainee counselors, as educators, and even as a professional? First, it reminds us that emotional struggles like social anxiety aren't just personal issues to manage quietly. They can shape how we grow and relate as therapists, and if left unacknowledged, they may interfere with how we access support or even how connected we feel to our clients. This means training programs and courses need to go beyond simply providing resources. Supervision, peer groups, and tutor support are essential, but only if they're emotionally safe. If trainees fear judgment or feel like they have to perform a version of themselves that looks fine, the very support they need might remain out of reach. So, part of the work is cultural. How can we create environments where struggling is seen not as a weakness, but as a part of becoming? There's also a preventative angle here. If we can identify social anxiety earlier in our training, we might help reduce the risk of long term disconnection or burnout later on. And that matters not just for the well being of counselors, but for the quality of the work we do. Ultimately, this research invites us to think more deeply about how we support each other, not just structurally, but emotionally. Now, as with any research, there are some limitations to keep in mind. First, the sample size was relatively small and based entirely in the UK, which means we can't generalize the findings to all trainee counselors, especially internationally. Secondly, because this was a cross sectional design, we can't make strong causal claims. We know the variables are related, but we can't say for sure that burnout causes social anxiety or that social anxiety causes disconnection. We need longitudinal research to explore those dynamics more deeply. I also relied on self report measures. While these are widely used, they do depend on how honest or self aware participants feel at the time, and social anxiety might affect even that. Another important point is that all participants reported experiencing some level of social anxiety. While that's telling in itself, it meant there was no clear control group to compare to, which could be valuable in future studies. And finally, one area that deserves closer attention is the kind of social connections we're talking about. Is it peer support during training? Is it supervisory relationships or the therapeutic alliance with clients? These may all be experienced very differently, especially for those navigating social anxiety. So, future research could really benefit from digging deeper into that. Not just how connected we feel, but where and with whom that connection is actually taking place. So, what's the take home message from all of this? We often assume that those training to help others are already resilient, composed, emotionally ready, but the truth is, many of us carry quiet battles into the therapy room. And some of these battles, like social anxiety, shape how we show up long before we even speak. What I found is that social anxiety doesn't just make things feel uncomfortable, it can influence how we connect, how we ask for help, and whether we truly feel we belong in this profession. We focus so much on getting it right, the skills, the theory, the therapeutic stance, but connection begins when we look in the mirror and say, I don't feel okay today, and still feel we belong. So maybe the real challenge isn't just learning to sit with our clients, it's learning to sit with ourselves too. Let's honor our challenges, not as flaws to be hidden, but as part of the very work we do. Because the truth is, we don't leave ourselves to the door, and maybe we're never meant to. Thank you for listening, and feel free to drop any questions you might have in the comments, and I'll be happy to answer them. Bye.